Hello, everyone. I'm Victoria Main, CEO at Combita Associates. Welcome to the latest of our Brussels Calling media debates, the series which turns the tables on journalists and requires them to answer rather than just ask questions, is entering its 7th year. Today, we focus on what it takes for Europe to catch up with China and the US and become a digital leader. As moderator, we're thrilled to have Margrethe Vestager, the European Commission's Executive Vice President for a Europe Fit for the Digital Age. The Executive Vice President, who is also Competition Commissioner, will be grilling our panel of tech and innovation journalists. Before handing over to Mrs. Vestager, allow me to introduce our stellar panel. No stranger to the Brussels crowd is Natalia Drozdiak, who's the European technology correspondent for Bloomberg and also previously worked at the Wall Street Journal. In London, we have John Thornhill, who is the FT's innovation editor and also host of the Tech Tonic podcast series, which not surprisingly features Mrs. Vestager. Crossing the Atlantic, Kara Swisher has been described by Newsweek as Silicon Valley's most powerful tech journalist. Kara is an opinion editor at the New York Times and host of the podcast Sway. Last but far from least, we have old Brussels hand, Ryan Heath. Ryan not only launched Politico Europe's Playbook newsletter, but he made it a morning must-read. A true citizen of the world, he's gone on to launch the Global Translations newsletter from his US base. Rest assured, everybody, there will be time for questions to the journalists at the end, so please feed them into the Q&A chat, and also feel free to tweet using the Brussels Calling hashtag. Thank you very much. Enough of me, over to you, Mrs. Vestager.
Well, thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you for the introductions. As you can see, this is really an excellent panel. These are the 4 people that shapes opinions, that decides what we should read, what we should talk about on any other day of the week. So I've really been looking forward for this. And in particular, since we are in really tricky times. Obviously, in my own country, Denmark, today is the 1st year anniversary for the lockdown. As today, the Prime Minister held a first of many press conferences to completely lock down the country. And that, I think, is one of the things that we will discuss today. How do you see the role of the state? The role of the state in a pandemic, but also the role of the state when it comes to technology. Because one of the things that we have ahead of us right now is, of course, for democracy to catch up with the technological development. Part of that, in order to make the most of technology, there's so many things that can happen that was not at all possible before. But in order to unleash that potential of better health, connectivity, mobility, all the many promises of world-class education for everyone, to unleash that, obviously we need to get better in control of the dark side of tech. And that is why we are on an endeavor of regulation, just as well as an endeavor of upskilling, reskilling, and investment. We started out almost to the day a year ago with a digital strategy as to how to make the most of digitization in Europe to the benefit of citizens. Because this will be a turning point, I think, so to realize that, yes, it may be technical. Yes, they may talk about nodes. Yes, they talk about microelectronics, but it's really about people. It's about what we want to achieve, what we dream about, how we push things. And this is not a new thing, because we have the privacy regulation already. We have the copyright regulation already, but we have pushed forward. We have, on the input side of things, the Data Governance Act to make sure that more data can be made available. We will follow that up with a Data Act to come later this year. But from the privacy and the copyright sort of line of thinking, this way that you can trust your surroundings, you can trust your neighbors, you can trust your authority in also in a digital world. Because of that, we will also launch the regulation on AI to be trustworthy. That is also later this year in a couple of months. But most topical, probably what we just launched, the Digital Decade, which basically says, let's make sure when we do this that we set a target, that we measure our target, that we know where to do. In 4 specific areas, skills, both basic for everyone and high level for 20 million people by 2030. The digitization to reach everyone, so infrastructure, and then of course for businesses to make the most of it, and for government to enable public services to be delivered in a digital way. That, of course, that's targeting and the milestones, they're important to make sure that we use taxpayers' funding in the best possible way and crowd in more digital funding. And last but not least, of course, that we make sure that digital contributes to reaching our climate targets. There will be no green transition without a climate target, without digitization to be used. One of the things that we probably also discussed today is the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, 2 pieces of regulation that comes together to make sure that that there is a democratic consequence of success. In Europe, you're more than welcome to be successful in doing business, but with success comes power, and with power comes responsibility. And this is why in the Digital Markets Act, those who are very successful and has de facto become gatekeepers in our digital markets, that they get a responsibility that we have been inspired from for the competition law enforcement, but also from our market insights. So all of that and much more for the next 10 years to come. We are, of course, since this is about the society that citizens live in, and the perception of citizens, of course, is of crucial importance, because if you don't feel ownership, if you don't feel counted in, well, how would you ever feel that these decisions is something that is relevant for you? And this is one of the reasons why media is of crucial importance, because just as well as this can be used to bring people on board, it can be used to polarize us to a degree that is unforeseen. Probably humans have been lying ever since we were able to speak, just guessing. But the ability to detect when someone is telling you something that is not true, that has to reach completely different levels, because the scope and the speed of falsehood is so much bigger in a digitalized democracy. And here, of course, media also plays an unforeseen important role in enabling us to come together as to what is reality, what problems should we try to find solutions for. And again, it boils down to the fact that technology is technology. How it's used is up to us as humans. How we see it, to a very large degree, is up to journalists. And this is one of the reasons why I've been really looking forward for today's discussion. So first and foremost, to sort of get us all warmed up, maybe you would take us through how your ways of working has changed during the last year, where everyone has been working from home, trying to make the most of digital technology. Natalie, would you get us started?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's mind-blowing that it's already been a year working from home, and I guess in some respects that's going to stay the same for a while, and even after the pandemic is over, I think everyone can expect more working from home going forward. I think the one downside has been, not being able to attend conferences where you can have these casual discussions with people like yourself and other executives, and just exchange ideas there. You know, Zoom is great, but it's always a bit more formalized. But yeah, there are pros. Like, I never thought I would be speaking to the digital commissioner while wearing yoga pants, for instance. But yeah, I mean, we just have to make do. And I think to some degree, I think working from home as a journalist is doable. I mean, we have Zoom and phone and that kind of thing.
Ryan, you're known to know everything that is ongoing. How does one pick up when you have to do it in a digital way? I'm really curious to hear this.
Yeah, well, you actually can't when you're in a new country. So I was around in the US for 4 or 5 months before the lockdowns began. And it means a lot of your relationships either never got started or were frozen in time to some extent. So I find it a bit fragmented and annoying now. Everything happens in these small increments. You're bombarded with messages from many platforms at once. Like my brain is fried at the end of the day. And I find real problems putting boundaries around that. And I feel guilty when I put boundaries around it. At the same time, just before I got on this call, I was interviewing the foreign minister of Austria, and he was pointing out some stuff about how he can get on the phone now with Antony Blinken all the time, or he's in much better touch with his other European colleagues. And that was an accurate point as well, where there's now a consistency to the communication, where it's not these peaks and troughs of running into you at a conference and then no contact for 6 weeks sort of thing. I can have these incremental relationships, but I feel like I'm not doing the bonding that I want to do that makes people want to spill all of that tea to me. So yeah, a lot of downs, but you manage.
And Kara, starting a podcast under these circumstances, how is that? Because you can possibly not be sort of with the people that you talk with.
Yeah, I've been working from home for 20 years. So I started my company at home and worked in the back of a cottage and had people remote for a long time. So we've been using all the various digital tools to communicate with each other for a long time. And I think this is the way most people will be working going forward, or there's going to be a huge prevalence. When you think about what's going to happen and what's going to change, you sort of think about COVID learnings, if you want to use that term. I think you're going to look at each area and see which one did better. And I think the idea of travel is going to be lessened by significantly. It also has climate change benefits and people not traveling as much. You'll see more people working from home. I talked to the head of India's biggest conglomerate, and he said he had 30% of people working home before the pandemic, and after the pandemic, he expects 70% of people to work at some point at home during the week for convenience sake and things like that, and money saving and there's all kinds of cost savings, and a lot of companies will take advantage of it. And then other places like teleeducation has worked somewhat for older kids, but definitely not for younger kids in this country. It's just been a disaster here from a mental health perspective and a learning perspective, and other stuff will stick. And so I do think I've been fine. I started the entire Sway podcast online, and we use a lot of really great technology to have these interviews, and they're actually quite intimate in some ways to be doing them like this. And if you can see them while you're doing, I just did Spike Lee earlier this week, but we had a really great conversation. We're looking right at each other. It might have been different in person. I used to do maybe half my interviews in person before, and now I do them all online. I don't know if I'll go back to doing them in person as much as I used to. I don't know. We'll see. It just depends on the person, but definitely live events. We haven't done those, but we pulled off some very great live events. We did a Pivot School live, and it was terrific, and we had great response. So I think it's we'll see. I think there'll be definitely more telework being done by everybody, largely because businesses want to save money, and greed is always the factor that tends to win out in these arenas.
Well, thank you, John. You also been working from home, at least partly. So how to check sources if they tell you the full story? That must be sort of a key of a journalistic tool.
Yes, I've had kind of two experiences from working from home. I mean, one has been with my FT hat on, We're a 133-year-old institution, and I didn't think it was possible to produce a newspaper and a website entirely remotely. I used to be news editor in London a few years ago and would have thought it was unimaginable that we could have done it. But I salute my colleagues because we have been able to produce a newspaper which we print globally, and we've produced a website every day, and video and audio as well, all remotely. I think that's a phenomenal achievement. With another hat on, I've had 2 years ago, I launched a website which is backed by the FT, but is independently run, called Sifted.eu, which is writing about European startups. And we have a team now of about 25 people. This has been a very strange experience because I haven't met in person half the people who now work for the company, and hiring people remotely is a very strange thing. So I'm quite intrigued actually to find the people, to meet the people that we've hired doing this. So I'm looking forward to that. To get to your question on sources, I mean, I think I suspect we're all very heavily reliant on talking to people that we have already met in real life before. It's obviously incredibly hard to establish a rapport on a Zoom call or just on the telephone. So I think that is hard. But that said, a lot of important people have been traveling a lot less, and therefore they have more time, I think, to speak to journalists. So I've been quite surprised by the ability to pin people down. That's been a lot easier. And I get the sense that a lot of kind of CEOs or officials are actually extraordinarily bored, and they're quite happy to talk to journalists. They want to have a few contacts with people outside their own bubbles.
Well, yes, I think you have a good point in that by now people are getting bored. They're done with Netflix, and you know, also puzzles, they have their limited charms. So no, I think you're right. There is something there, but I've been wondering if since the state has taken a different role, how you see this, but also if you have a sense of communication being more controlled, more limited, more directed, with fewer sort of voices of opposition or criticism. Who would want to kick that off? Ryan?
Yeah, I would say that there is 2 answers to the question, at least in my view. So the first one is, yes, to John's point, more access than ever because people aren't stuck on planes in the way that they used to be. But because we're accelerating use of all of these digital platforms, you have people with more ways to control their message. And to your earlier point about gatekeepers, yes, gatekeepers have more ways to block us from getting to people like you at different points. And I think individually, some of this doesn't matter, but in aggregate, it's a big problem. You know, one other point I wanted to mention was we see a lot of leaders who now go and get interviewed either by other CEOs or by think tanks, for example. And that doesn't matter in a one-off situation, but in aggregate, when the idea is that leaders can avoid hard questions, I think we might look back in 5 or 10 years and think, why did we blow up our democracy in this way? And it's very hard for a journalist to say that. You basically sound like a whiny bitch if you say like, oh, I got passed over for an interview because you went to the Atlantic Council. But that is like going to be a tension going forward, I think. And I hope leaders still come and talk to us.
But I think we can make a deal here, because if journalists stop interviewing journalists, I'm sure the rest will also disappear, more or less.
Okay, fair point. I take that.
Natalia, how do you see this? Do you feel that communication is more controlled now? Is it more difficult to find a critical voice?
I mean, I guess to some extent it hasn't changed that much in terms of finding sources, if that's what you're asking. But I think it's true that technology has really exacerbated and polarized certain views. At least that's what you see on Twitter, and those are the views that are more exacerbated and can drive the news of the day. I mean, like the GameStop Reddit example is a good one. You know, this all just kind of started or ballooned out of discussions that were on a social media platform, and obviously wasn't filtered through journalists and that kind of thing. So, you know, I think that is a trend that is accelerating.
Thank you, Kara. The way you work, do you find that that there is more control of sort of messaging from authorities, and that people are also asking for less criticism, or is that very different from country to country depending on culture?
Well, I don't live in other countries, so I can only say what happens here. I wrote about, I'm sorry, I'm back on my phone because we're of course having an internet outage here in DC. But I think one of the things that's interesting is how much what's come into sharp relief is how much we rely on tech, and you've noticed how wealthy the tech companies have gotten over the past couple of months, and through no innovation. Like I don't begrudge people making money from innovation, but this is just because we're using their stuff more and we are dependent on them in a way that we now recognize is really problematic. And so one of the things that's interesting is the vaccine distribution system. I just wrote about it last week in the New York Times, which I don't know what's happening in each of your countries or all the countries, but in this country, there's 57 different tech systems addressing all the different populations, which seems insane when we have national ability to do these things, or global ability to do these things. And so there's been a lot of criticism that each state or municipality has a different technology solution. And here in DC, Microsoft was the vendor for DC, and the government settled on a one-tier system where everybody runs through the door at the same time, which you can imagine. I called it the vaccine Hunger Games, that anyone was trying to get in, and when they opened it for a group larger than the small group they started with, it became a disaster. And I was sort of like the 1980s called and want their internet back. It was, slows, capture didn't work and things like that. And so me and many others are very critical of how DC rolled out that system because it wasn't effective. And you understood what they were trying to do. They were trying to reach more vulnerable populations, especially people of color and the elderly who had been impacted more, which is the smart thing to do. But the way they did it was both unfair and useless. And so, there's been a lot of criticism. And initially they started to blame the user, like, well, you shouldn't rush into the door. That was the first thing, or clear your cache. That was another thing the CTO of DC said. I was like, nobody knows I know how to clear my cache, but it's hard for me to clear my cache. And I had 3 browsers going and 2 different computers. So I'm very tech literate, and I still didn't get an appointment. And so I think people are aware of the fact that they depend on technology, and that the excuse that government shouldn't be able to monitor technology is over. I mean, this is it's like saying, I'm in government, I don't know how to use roads or telephones or things like that. It needs to be, the upgrading of technology systems with control by the government has to be we have to really assess what happened, especially around vaccine distribution. And at the same time, with these hacks that are going on, how the government talks to each other about cyber issues has to be more coordinated in some fashion. SolarWinds and this new Microsoft Exchange hack just goes right to the heart of the fact that we are jacked in here and are not getting results, and at the same time are much more vulnerable than ever before.
Would you pick up on that, John? This issue about how do we see technologies on balance? Because on the one hand side, there's been a lot of value created with big tech, while at the same time a lot of breakthrough innovation has been made thanks to tech. The vaccines, I think, is an obvious example to that. While at the same time, I think Kara's experience is something that a lot of people have experienced. That still, if there is a giant use or a giant demand for something, then it can be very difficult for the solution actually to be able to manage. So on balance, how do you see tech today? Is it, as you would ask me, is it a winner or a loser?
Well, I mean, tech itself has clearly been a winner. I mean, we've seen astonishing rises in the share prices of all the big tech companies. I do think that we as journalists focus rightly on a lot of the negative aspects of technology and a lot of things that need to be fixed. But I think there is a case for focusing a lot more on a lot of the positive aspects of tech. And in particular, I'll talk about healthcare. I mean, I think in my own country, Britain, we've had an extraordinarily mixed experience of how tech has dealt with healthcare. The test and trace system has been pretty much a disaster. People have distrusted it. We've had really very poor communication, I think, of what's gone on. But when you look across Europe, we all have publicly funded healthcare systems, and the possibilities for using technology to improve healthcare is just enormous. And for when we were able to travel, I used to go to a really fascinating conference in Stanford on kind of healthcare and AI. And they would gather together a lot of computer scientists and healthcare experts and academics and doctors and talk about how you could run a healthcare system in an ideal way if everyone had access to data, how you could use it to improve the administration of healthcare, run hospitals more efficiently, reduce costs, develop drugs more effectively. And it's extraordinarily difficult to do that in such a fragmented healthcare system as in America. But there's an enormous opportunity, I think, in Europe to do things differently through kind of publicly funded healthcare systems. The NHS in Britain is trying to get its act together in this front. But I mean, I think that's where there could be a lot more emphasis on thinking about positive use cases of data and how policy can help support that.
Indeed, I myself have been a bit disappointed in some of the solutions on Kara's point, that if you can be together, if you can see each other, if you can have eye contact, it can be great. And I still think that some of our meeting formats, they really need improvements in order to bring us closer to one another. But that's maybe a personal note on that. If you look at this sort of increase in value that has been there, the display of all the positive things that can be achieved, what do you think that we should think about when we are on this mission to disable the dark side of tech to enable the positive potential? Anyone? Yeah.
Well,
Ryan.
oh, go ahead. I was just
I'll give you the unorthodox answer, and I think you've already been on this track for a while, Commissioner. It's related to tax. You know, like I accept all the points about accountability of tech and proper rigorous enforcement of rules, but until we collect enough tax to fund the systems that allow equitable access to vaccines or technology or any other infrastructure that we want, we're screwed in lots of ways. And as the tech companies have accumulated all of this value at these crazy high profit margins through questionable business models, until we figure out a way to crack the tax nut, I'm not sure that we're going to achieve a lot of the things that we want to achieve. And I know you've tried on your state aid rules, and I think there's better solutions, and you use the only tools you had. But I would just say tax, tax, tax.
Kara, what do you think? You were, I saw you jumping in.
I think she just
jumped out.
Yeah.
Well, Natalie, you take it from here then.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with Ryan. I think it's clear that the Commission and you as well have tried to address, you know, the negative sides with the various regulation. I mean, the tricky aspect is that we've seen that despite, you know, the many rules that Brussels has come out with, it still hasn't addressed some of these major problems, or it hasn't fixed it. Somehow it just kind of keeps slipping through. In terms of what could be done, you know, it's I don't have a good answer there. It's a tricky one. Like, you know, with the DMA and the DSA, I think it's clear that Brussels is trying a different approach on that front, you know, in terms of tackling illegal content, in terms of tackling, you know, bad behavior and market power. And it, you know, I'll be curious to see if that works. The downside is that it will also take time to enforce, because the DMA will require probes as do competition investigations. So, you know, it's also something that will take time, and the more time that we give, you know, we allow these harmful effects to continue gathering steam on the internet.
Well, actually, we try to avoid exactly this point of very lengthy procedures by being able to designate a gatekeeper on objective and qualitative and quantitative criteria, exactly because of this. But Kara, I see that you're back.
Yeah, sorry about that. Something's going wrong with the Kaflooey today, of course, here with the internet. I don't know what's going. There's some construction going on. I suspect they keep getting stopped. The point I was making before was that we've seen the dark side rather clearly on January 6th with the attack on the Capitol, and the very close linkage, if you look at all the pleadings by the various people who are being arrested, who have been arrested and are on their way to jail, presumably, is they all say they learned everything on Facebook or on Parler or something like that. Or this was, you can't fully blame social media, but the constant drumbeat of propaganda that occurred and was reinforced over and over again is something that is being looked at. We're going to be having hearings about that very soon. But one of the things that really drives me crazy is in 2019, I sketched out this exact scenario of Trump losing, putting out propaganda about election fraud, and then calling for incitement of violence. This is stuff that should have been anticipated by a lot of these social media companies. And again, you and I have talked about this issue, is that there, you know, if there's a dark side, there is a dark side. And we have to figure out how to, especially in this country where we do have the First Amendment, how to get government involved here in ways that are positive, either through taxation or liability or something else, because we certainly can't do it by fiat, by a speech fiat. And so it's a really difficult thing. But what happens is in the white space, these companies are allowed to get bigger, stronger, hire more lobbyists, and have more influence. And that's the problem we face is not so much speed, in that speed, yes, the United States has had almost no legislation whatsoever that counts for tech companies. But the proof of the problem, for some reason, keeps getting proved and nobody does anything about it. And that's the difficulty we face in this country, is actually putting into place guardrails that are necessary to control big tech, including whether it's antitrust or anything else. And I think the two appointments that are happening in the Biden administration are really indicative of where they are, with Lina Khan, which is supposedly going to be an FTC commissioner, which is one of the key agencies. Possibly, if they decide to give more money to the FTC, would be another big sign, if Congress does, and more heft. And then, of course, Tim Wu at the National Economic Council. So the indications from the Biden administration and some bipartisan legislation that is going forward is really, will be interesting to see what happens. I mean, we're never where you guys are years ago, but it's certainly moving in that direction.
And that question of how to enable change, we see increasing budgets for lobbying in Brussels, and you know, sort of kind of the first sentence in any book of economics: you only pay if it works. So you are some of the people who must be quite, you know, the targeting for that lobbying. Because it's much more refined than going directly for the legislature. So how do you deal with that? You must have quite a balancing act to do to figure out what is legitimate, taking care of interest, and when am I being a tool for someone who basically just want to have their message through in a somewhat, well, in your case, really credible way. Natalie?
Or Go ahead,
Yeah,
Natalie.
so I can jump in really quick. I mean, I think that's why it's so important to have journalists, because in general, most of us are trained to balance our reporting as much as possible. So even if We have to report, a company's specific argument, even if we might not agree with it. We also have to consider the opposite side of it. I mean, I think what I find challenging is specifically when it comes to lobbying and hearing the company's arguments with regards to regulation is that we often hear the same argument, which is that, the X regulation is going to harm our ability to innovate. And we've heard that all along. We've heard that, since Brussels was discussing GDPR, and then a few years later, they turn around and say, oh, actually, we're big proponents of GDPR. So, it's a bit of like a boy cried wolf situation. And you have to really understand the arguments to see, whether there is credibility there or not.
John, do you want to add something on this?
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree with Natalia. But I do think it's a case of very much that governments and journalists have to talk to and understand the case of the insurgents in many of these industries as much as the incumbents. And clearly, the structures that we've had do favor the people with power. And as Cara was saying, the kind of competition rules have been very much focused on what is the consumer welfare, and that is not obvious in many of these cases with tech. And Tim Wu and Lina Khan and the EU Commission itself clearly have been trying to rethink that. Should we be thinking about market structures and the ability of people to compete? I think that's a far more fruitful area of activity. So I think certainly as journalists, we should listen to the powerful tech companies, and we should try to understand what they're saying. But I think that a lot of academics who don't have any particular interest in a subject, although that in itself is difficult because so many academics are now linked to companies or think tanks or whatever, there are very few truly independent voices. I think civil society, but I think particularly kind of insurgent companies who are trying to do things in different ways and are competing against the big tech companies, we should listen very carefully to what they are telling us and to give them a fair hearing.
Yeah, I would say, I would add that the economics of this whole dynamic is very difficult. So you look at what was the market cap those big 5 or 6 companies gained over the last year, $2.7 trillion, something in that order. You look at the sort of fines that you've issued against them, Commissioner, even several billion at a time. So what's 5 million on lobbying in comparison to that? It's literally a rounding error. So they cannot lose by spending that lobbying money, even if it doesn't really get them anywhere. And a very good case in point that I remember from my time working with Nelly Cruz back, your predecessor at the EU, when we did the first $1 billion fine against Intel, we'd actually calculated that they got away with 21 billion in illegal behavior that we were enforcing against them. So they're still 20 billion up after all of the lobbying and all of the bad behavior. So it's a very hard position for you to be in. At the same time, I think they're often very inefficient. And I'll use Facebook and Sheryl Sandberg as an example there, where I know Facebook is one of the big spenders, but they don't really read their own press. Like there's just so many silos and walls in that company now. So the top people like Mark and Nick and Sheryl are all insulated. You go somewhere like Davos, they invite you into their fancy little pavilion that they set up. They have zero interest in answering your questions or even listening to you. They will herd you into a room for like a 5-person focus group. Sheryl will come in with a Madonna microphone and go through some bullshit theater about how this is because it's to protect her voice. And then she just talks at you for an hour. And it's the biggest waste of an hour ever. I won't do it anymore, basically. So it's got this guise of being very sophisticated lobbying, and it's total nonsense. And I think a lot of that is falling flat, but they have a lot of incentives to just keep doing it and, hope something sticks.
They are going out lately. I've noticed Facebook has gone out lately to a lot of friendly journalists, more friendly journalists. If you notice, I've been trying to get Mark, he doesn't have a great time doing interviews with me, but I think it shows what he actually thinks. But he's there, you're going to see like a real press of friendlier journalists, that people they just want to hear your point of view. I think they will not be doing tough interviews or anywhere where they can expose themselves or step up in some way. And that makes sense for them. I think what's important to keep in mind, to get up what you just said, is that these companies there's no such thing as big tech. I keep saying this, there's no such thing. There is Apple, which has a particular problem that can be fixed, and it's probably in a much easier way. You have Microsoft, another bunch of issues, Amazon, another very different group of issues around marketplace, largely around marketplace and employees, essentially. You have Uber, for example, employees are the issue there. And then you have companies like Google and Facebook, which are unique in terms of monopolistic practices and sort of menace behavior. And so that's the difficulty, is that we tend to lump them in when in fact, there are some you can work with, like what Apple is doing around Facebook will probably be much more effective than any 10 legislators, like putting out that opt-in notice that they're going to do is much more effective about dealing with that, with Facebook, than I think anybody else. That's their existential threat, not any regulator in Brussels or the United States, really.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see that there is actually someone who's doing things that people will have to see up front. And on that note, we have heard a number of the tech companies calling for regulation now for quite some time. Has that any bearing, or is that just a where is my next defense? I should call for some regulation because probably they'll never ever get to it, and if they get to it, they will never implement it or enforce it.
Well, it advantages the big companies to do, it puts things into amber, essentially. And so I think the stuff we need to look at is their acquisitions and to facilitate more support for small startups. You're starting to see some competition in the social media space right now. You're starting to see little bits of competition in the e-commerce space. And so governments have to encourage that, while at the same time designing the laws that will not advantage the larger companies and their teams of lawyers and lobbyists and such.
John, on you know this from the Sifted work that you do, this intersection between smaller companies, startup, what is new, and the incumbents. Is there a tension here that the bigger ones, they're basically asking for regulation for that to help them against the smaller ones who will have more difficulties in dealing with regulatory pressure?
Sure. I think you definitely saw that with kind of GDPR, that this was, I think, a very good attempt to try to put privacy at the focus of everyone's attention. But I mean, as Cara was saying, I think it has benefited a lot of the incumbents, the big tech companies, if I can use that term, have found it very easy to comply with it. I mean, it costs them a lot of money, but they could afford to do so. And a lot of smaller companies have really struggled to comply with GDPR. It's been a lot costlier. And there has been a kind of moat that has been built around some of the tech companies. So I think, yes, I mean, reducing regulation, enabling companies to compete is also a factor that we should bear in mind when we're trying to promote competition. Regulation can help promote competition, but it can also stifle it as well. And trying to get that balance right is an extraordinarily difficult thing.
One of the things that we have tried in both the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act is to have an asymmetry so that we have a very light touch, if any, on smaller businesses, but an increasing obligation on companies the bigger they get. And of course, the most sort of heavy-handed pressure on what we call gatekeepers. There is a comment in the Q&A facility, and I will encourage people to use it if you have a question here. A comment saying, well, that a competition case or regulation would kill innovation. That was the Microsoft argument 10, 15 years ago. It's the Google argument now. That doesn't seem to have any bearing, but where do you see innovation in this game, sort of in the broader space? Are we here back to the acquisition issue, or is that just a sort of sense of distributed innovation? Ryan?
Yeah, well, I think you have the answer in your own numbers already. the EU, where it's been soft, if I may say so, the softest part of the competition infrastructure is mergers, like much more of, like so many of them get cleared, let's say. So you've got a lot of scope to move there. But competition is what drives innovations. And when you have these clogged up markets with a few people or one person, one company dominating them, that's when innovation is held back. You made your digital decade announcement yesterday, I think, or Tuesday, sorry. And the very next day, Apple, who you took to the cleaners for $15 billion over their Irish taxes, announces chip production in Germany. So, you know, like they weren't scared off by you making a tough announcement. They're always going to have the scope to do that as big companies. And the more competition that you try and juice into the market, the more innovation that they're going to be forced to deliver. And to circle back slightly to one of those regulation points, you know, I looked at the Facebook Australia situation, and one of my takeaways, I'm always trying to look for some other deeper layer rather than what's at the surface. And the way that Microsoft came behind and backed the Australian government in that case, they obviously had a competitive interest to do it. But what they were really doing was learning the lesson of all the EU's enforcement from 10 years ago. And it was finally an example of a big tech company that backed a specific regulation instead of saying, you know, we support regulation in general, but we just hate this regulation and we just hate this amendment. You know, they finally got the message and backed it. And I think that if you keep enforcing, in 15 years, the others will have the message as well.
But you know, if I should ever have a tattoo, it would be competition drives innovation, because it is indeed true and it goes in every sector. So message well taken. Natalie?
Yeah, I was just going to add, you know, I think one of the things that I've noticed about the EU as well in recent years, I think the discussion was so focused on regulation for so long, and it is, you know, still to some extent now, but I think there is also greater awareness amongst the EU officials to look at other tools besides regulation to promote innovation. I mean, you have this discussion around stock options, but also, you know, the European Innovation Council, which is now investing directly into startups with equity stakes, which is, you know, it's quite remarkable, I think. So it'll be interesting to see if that can, you know, provide another balance to the regulatory side in terms of promoting innovation.
I mean, just to pick up on what Natalia is saying, I mean, I think there is this new generation of entrepreneurs that is emerging around Europe, which I think is incredibly encouraging and inspiring to see. We're seeing companies emerge from all over Europe who are doing things in different ways and challenging some of the established companies. I mean, I think the emblematic company in a way is kind of UiPath, which emerged in Bucharest, a robotics process automation company, now worth about $35 billion at the last valuation it had in New York. Many companies are emerging around Europe, and I think that's where we ought to kind of be pinning our hopes on, that there is going to be a kind of new surge of these companies emerging that we can hope for. Just to go back to Ryan's point on Australia, I mean, I personally thought that was a really bad law that the Australian government tried to introduce, and pretty much everyone was wrong in that dispute. If the Australian government wants to support the media, then I think they should tax big companies properly and then have a very discreet program of supporting public journalism, if that's what you believe in. But to try to intervene in a kind of intercorporate dispute between the social media companies and the news media seemed to me to be a ridiculous thing to do. And then the way that Google responded, cutting a side deal with the Murdoch empire, the way that Facebook then deplatformed Australia, I think everyone was pretty much in the wrong. And Microsoft, I think actually it was quite a cynical move by them, the way that they intervened in Australia.
And not one journalist was helped. Well, not one, there wasn't one more hiring, one more new thing. You're right, well, the taxing is the way you go to it. What's really interesting is you all have an opportunity now. There is a lot more innovation. And look at the public offering of Roblox today, a company that moved into a white space, like moved into a space where that you had these big companies sort of deciding what would and would not get approved, like publishers essentially. And then you have this other company that has a platform that it also stresses safety of children on. So they're moving into a white space of, like, people are tired of it, or Shopify moving into a white space of retailers dissatisfied by Amazon. now I think it's up to $65 billion from $3 billion. I mean, that's very encouraging. They've decided to like lean into safety. They've decided there's all kinds of opportunities in the entrenched businesses already in social media and lots of places. Whatever you think of TikTok, it's moved into the nicer social media space where it's safer, where they spend a lot of time dealing with it. They're not always successful, but that's definitely their aim. And so what's really interesting to me is when you get into the ones that are actually truly competitive: cloud computing, AI, healthcare, climate change tech. There's real, and talk about autonomous vehicles, there's 400 companies now. Now that's going to be squished down at some point, but it shows the value of how quickly things can happen if there is competition within a space. And then the ones going into the future are critical, especially climate change tech, that we have a robust, innovative group of startups coming from all over the world, coming up with all kinds of solutions, whether it be carbon capture, which is just a mitigation strategy, whether it be clean energy, whether clean electricity, clean steel, what happened in Germany around clean steel was really interesting. And so going forward, the promotion of these startups, especially in spaces that don't have a dominant character in it, is really critical for governments to think about. And then lastly, I just did an interview with Mariana Mazzucato, who's talking about the role of government. This idea that government doesn't have a role is just, and that Silicon Valley pushes that they're the only ones that can innovate. Most of these Silicon Valley innovators got money from government. Elon Musk is one of the most famous examples. He got billions of dollars to get that company going, and how he's reaping the rewards. Government should play a critical role in investment, in getting a piece of it, in pushing forward, whether it's space travel or climate change tech, and it should stop pretending that it shouldn't have a role or that it doesn't have the skills to do so, because it certainly does. That's my feeling, and I recommend reading Mariana's book. The recent one is called Mission Economy, which is super interesting, of these public-private partnerships.
Well, I think you definitely find here, both at the European level and at national level in the Union, that government would push for innovation and make risk-willing capital available. But maybe lastly, just one point before we stop on this Australian issue, because it made the global press. It was everywhere. No matter where one is in the different aspects of it, it was all over the planet. The French issue with Google, where you both have the competition law enforcer having a case, and you have the back and forth with publishers, because France was the first to implement the copyright directive. That kind of news didn't travel very fast, and basically it's kind of the same. It's the same story. You have the publishers, you have the country, you have the giants coming in. It's the same narrative, and yet it didn't travel, not at all to the same degree. Is that a language issue, or why do you think that this happened? Because the Australian issue, I think it put it on everyone's map, not only as Australia, but also the question of how should value be distributed?
I'll dive in as the Australian if no one else wants to. It's partly language, but I think it's partly timing. So those first, I think, are 4 years old now, maybe. We saw before that the Belgian newspapers and then the Spanish cases with Google News as well. And they were about really discrete services within the whole company, whereas Facebook has just become this one blob, like it's this walled garden. And that I think, the English language, that Facebook is all a blob now, and it's trying to blob its WhatsApp and its Instagram all in together as well. And the fact that you have Rupert Murdoch as a protagonist and catalyst, he's the real monopolist in that situation. They own 70% of the Australian newspaper circulation and one of the big TV networks. So it's just this clash of titans when you throw that all together as a journalist narrative. And we've had 3 or 4 more years, that was my original point, of tech being the bad guys and people getting suspicious of them. So I think that's the ingredient mix there.
Yeah, I'm with you, Ryan. Like, I suspect it has a lot to do with the players involved in the Australia debate, because I was also a bit surprised, like, did everyone forget the years of contentious copyright debate that we had here? I mean, it's like no one remembered that there was actually a law that was passed in the EU that was addressing very similar issue.
Yes, and in a quite interesting environment, because here the lobbying was done by basically teenagers who was alerted to the question of Article 13, I think via YouTube, and all of a sudden, you know, members of parliament had to answer over the dinner table to their teenagers as to what they were doing. So I think lobbying to a completely different degree, with also very trustworthy people with very good access to lawmakers here. I have learned a lot. My great admiration and respect for you and the job you do is now even bigger. I have realized that journalism or moderating should not be my fallback position, so I may have to go for a third mandate. Pity everyone on that one.
You still made a headline out of this with that line.
No, not so much, not so much. But I'm still experimenting to see if any of those services would allow you to crack a joke, because that is one of the things I think we really lost during the pandemic. It's a sense of humor, because it's really, really difficult to maintain that be whatever sense of humor not allowed. But I want to thank you wholeheartedly. It has been for me really, really interesting. I hope someone out there has enjoyed it as well, because you have insights and you have a really difficult and really important job to do. So I will let you get on with that and send you a warm thank you from here. And the rest, Victoria, is for you.
I'd like to thank you very much, Mrs. Vestager, but I think you're overly modest. I think another career could be an interviewer. And thank you so much, our journalist panelists. It was just fascinating, the discussion. I'm really loath to call it to an end, but that's great. Thank you so much. And bye for now.
Bye for now.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.